Going to be in Spanish, so those of you that need interpretation, the headsets are in the hallway, and we just wanted to do that before we get started. Thank you. I think we'll be starting in about 2 minutes.
Well, I can't see the PowerPoint. If I sit there, then I have to struggle to see one move here. Can you see the PowerPoint? No.
From here?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, without doing a diabolical.
An exorcist type head turn, yes.
Can you see it?
Yes.
Oh, jeez. No, that's true.
I see so many faces here, many faces that I know. Terrific to be here this morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center, the nation's living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson. As you know, the only president of the United States with a PhD. My name's Duncan Wood. I am the director of the Mexico Institute here, and very, very new director of the Mexico Institute. This is in some ways my debutante ball, my first public event as director of the Mexico Institute, actually here at the Wilson Center. I'd like to begin with a big thanks to the Washington Office on Latin America. It's a terrific opportunity for us to collaborate in the presentation of this research with such figuras destacadas as we have here at the head of the table. As many of you know, we have a long history of collaboration with WOLA. That is going to continue, and I think it's particularly appropriate that as my first sort of public event here, that Maureen is here and that we'll begin working together. Talking of long histories, of course, the Mexico Institute, largely under the leadership of Andrew Seeley and Eric Olson, who I'd like to point out here today, has a great history of working on security issues and the question of police reform in particular. It has been one of the lead issues for the security program in the Mexico Institute, and will continue to be a major focus over the coming years. In fact, last week I was in the DF, and in many of my conversations there, the question of police reform, justice reform, obviously was fundamental. I was trying to bring up other issues, extradition, money laundering, etc. But the issue that people wanted to keep coming back to was actually police reform, and in particular police standards. And that's a conversation that we can have around this table later on today, I hope. You know, the questions of what are the appropriate standards, not just the best standards, but the appropriate standards for Mexico's current conditions is a pretty tricky question to answer. And I was particularly interested in some of the opinions of my Mexican colleagues who said to me, it's great that we have great standards, it's great that we have leading standards in the world, but there's never been any question about standards in Mexico. It's can you actually apply them, can you implement them, can you fulfill them? And we see this around Mexico, of course, in many areas of the rule of law, both in terms of security and, of course, in the economic rule of law. Mexico has great laws. The question is, how do we actually make those work? As I was flying home on Sunday morning, the in-flight attendant gave me a copy of Milenio, and I was flicking through, and there was a full-page ad for the police force of Nuevo León, recruiting. And it was the first time I'd seen one of these recruitment ads in the newspaper in this sense. First of all, they said how much you're going to get paid, 14,995 pesos a month. Great. It talked about the benefits package. You're going to get health insurance, life insurance, obviously very, very important. You're going to get training, etc., etc. And then I saw where they were actually recruiting, and they were recruiting in the Zócalo in Mexico City. And that really hit me. It was like, you know, they are scanning the entire nation to try to find enough people who are willing to go into the police force to fulfill those standards. We have two wonderful ponentes, presenters here today, Juan Salgado and Ernesto López Portillo. I will allow Maureen to make the proper introductions in a second. And of course, an old friend of mine, John Bailey, who I met my very first month, I think, in Mexico City. I lived in DF for 17 years as a professor, and when I was down there, this strange gringo came to visit called John Bailey, who seemed to know a lot more about Mexico than many of my colleagues who had actually lived in Mexico City for a long, long time. And I would still say that even after my 17 years, John knows a lot more about this particular issue than I ever will. But first of all, I'd like to just recognize Maureen Maya, who is also a fellow defeño, or defeña rather. She lived there for 5 years. It's terrific to have you here. Thank you so much for contacting us, and please consider this tu casa for future presentations. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Maureen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Duncan, for that great introduction. And obviously, thank you and to the Mexico Institute for opening up your doors to WOLA to co-host this event with us. I think, as you said, it's a very timely time to be discussing police reform efforts in Mexico, particularly as we transition into a new government in Mexico and a lot of unknowns about what they're planning on doing on security, but also a good time to put on the table lots of things that still need to be addressed in terms of police reform in Mexico. As Duncan mentioned, we've got some great speakers today. I'm going to present them in terms of when they speak. So we're going to start off with Juan Salgado, who is a professor at the Legal Studies Department of the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica, otherwise known as CIDE. He has done lots of research on police reform initiatives, police accountability, civilian oversight of law enforcement, and budgeting for public security. He's worked on multiple organizations and consulted on human rights projects both in Mexico, Europe, and Africa, and has given courses at universities and police academies. And I'm not going to go on more. He's got lots of interesting publications as well, but I will let Juan open the discussion today. So Juan, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. Can we get my presentation on, please? Or do I press play here?
Yes.
Should be there.
It should be there.
This is not my department.
One slide.
Yeah, it's only one. Is that yours?
It isn't that short.
Grab the top here, Salgado.
Here it is. There we go.
Abajo a la derecha, sí. Izquierda, izquierda, izquierda.
Sí, ¿verdad? What? Okay.
Working?
It's not working.
Oh, nice. I can.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, there are 3 parts in my presentation. First, I will try to summarize most of the most important reforms that have been taking place in the period 2000 to 2012 in Mexico regarding police reform. Then I will go to analyze briefly the setbacks and limitations of such reforms, and then to make some reflections on the way forward in terms of what needs to be done in legislative, normative, and policy decisions to reform police ranks in Mexico, and what are the challenges for the current administration, as well as the responses we are starting to see outlined, at least in the current administration. Just as a matter of introduction, there are a number of reforms going on in Mexico until 2012. First, we have some legislative reforms that dealt mainly with legislative action, with the representatives passing acts on policing and controlling the police. We also have a number of operational and security policy reforms that were carried out by the executive, and we also had a more limited amount of reforms that were carried out by the judiciary. If you think of the police reform process in the US that first went on through several decades of professionalization and improving police standards in the US, and then went on to having judicial rulings and case law to curb police action, use of force, etc., and finally getting a more community approach in most recent years. We're trying to do everything in 10 years in Mexico, so it's been very challenging in that sense. To get a rough idea of the number of officers in Mexico, it's around 450,000 sworn officers, and most of them are either municipal or state officers. We only have less than 10% of federal police officers, and most of the resources and the priorities in terms of policy have been devoted to federal police reform. In terms of normative reforms, it's important to highlight that we talk a lot about legislative paralysis in Mexico, but actually a lot has been passed in terms of public security legislation in recent years. First of all, it's important to underscore the importance of the 2008 amendment to the National Public Security System Act. For the first time in Mexico, we had a legislation that enables coordination between federal, municipal, and state police bodies. And we also had a state institution in which representatives of the state governments and the federation are already taking decisions within the same body, which made a big change. This is only from 2008 to now. We have the Anti-Organized Crime Act, which is also a very important legislative resource. For the first time, we have a legal definition of organized crime in Mexico. And from a policy perspective, as organized crime has been the main target of policing action and military action in Mexico in recent years, it's been a very important reform. We have the Federal Police Act that was also amended in 2008. It was very important because it allowed the federal police for the first time in Mexico to do undercover investigations, to engage in a number of activities that can be classified as intelligence, that would be classified as intelligence in many other countries, but without judicial permission. I mean, it's very much doing it on their own. We also had a number of constitutional amendments to reform criminal proceedings, criminal law in Mexico, to establish oral proceedings and due process in Mexico. That's also very recent at federal level from 2008. And we also had some reforms on small-scale drug dealing, which had a huge impact in local policing because for the first time it allowed municipal and state police officers to get involved into drug dealing issues, which was normally a federal police activity. So, in terms of policy framework, one of the main features of the strategy was to engage in an all-out combat of drug cartels instead of focusing on risk factors and crime prevention. So the strategy is centered so much in a sort of open season on drug lords, trying to hunt these drug lords and trying to get them like either killed or imprisoned or extradited. So it was very much an offensive strategy instead of trying many other financial intelligence or other more comprehensive strategies against drug crime. And this, of course, involves heavily the use of police officers and the military. The armed forces have been used extensively in a period that was supposed to be used to reform the police officers. As we don't have, as we have corrupt and rather inoperant police officers in most of the country, it was argued that we needed the armed forces to take the place of police officers in public security tasks for a while, but we never had a clear timeline in terms of how long would that be, and in terms of how the police ranks would be reformed. In terms of the operational framework, we had this professionalization or this development of standards that went into recruiting, training, police career, promotion, and police development. There was a huge development, especially if we compare to previous years in the period 2007 to 2012. There was also an increase in deployment. We, for the first time, had a nationwide presence of the federal police dealing with anti-narcotics and combat organized crime in different parts of the country. We also had a huge amount of investment in equipment and in improving the technological capacities of investigating in the police. Just so you can have an idea, the funds from the Merida Initiative amount to approximately 3% of the budget that is allocated in Mexico for public security, to have an estimation of how much the government invested in the last years, which hasn't sadly translated into having a more efficient police system. And for the first time, we had a systematic operational procedure system for sworn officials going on, which developed a number of standards for detention, for patrolling, for different police operations, which was also a big difference in the last years. In terms of the judiciary has been in many ways the big absent. The legislators have passed a lot of laws. The officers in the executive branch have been responsible for doing these questionable policies in terms of human rights and in terms of confronting the drug dealers, but they have finally done a lot of action. But however, the judiciary has been quite reluctant in terms of processing corrupt officers and dealing with police corruption and the hard issues regarding detentions, human rights abuses, and all civil rights abuses related to police action. Until 2011, the Supreme Court they could trigger a fact-finding mechanism that was not much very used, but they did some fact-finding in terms of police abuse. They particularly took two cases, Atenco and Oaxaca. The Supreme Court, they failed to actually make responsible the high ranks in these cases. They established responsibility for the lower ranks, but it was a missed opportunity for the first time to establish responsibility for high-rank officers in police abuse cases in Mexico. So they were not made accountable for extreme human rights abuses. There is a minimal adjudication in terms of police abuse cases in the judiciary in Mexico. As you know, the judicial system works very much on adjudication, so it depends on the criminal law system bringing the cases up to the courts. So these cases are mostly resolved within administrative procedures inside the police bodies, which are many times flawed, and so there is also very few things that have been happening in this case. However, two cases have been notorious in terms of their mediatic exposure. First, the case of Acteal in Chiapas, where a number of presumed or alleged human rights violators and possibly killers were liberated after many years in prisons for flaws in due procedure and for not following adequate police detention. So these two cases, Acteal and Florence Cassé, they actually amount to a sort of Miranda case in Mexico. It's interesting because they have finally in the court made bold decisions in terms of liberating Florence Cassé, who is a French citizen and who was probably a kidnapper, liberating her for problems in her detention regarding due process, and the same with the responsible for the Acteal massacre. So some changes have been going on there, but it's still very little action. In terms of setbacks and structural limitation, as I mentioned, there is no specific timeline in terms of having the police, the armed force officers, both military and Navy, in the field. So this is very confusing, both for the armed forces and for the police officers. There's so much confusion on what is the role and how long do they have to stay there in terms of their anti-narcotic activity. They did not achieve proper regulations on the use of force. They developed a lot of standards in the federal police, but they did not get to develop proper standards for use of force, so it's still a pending issue. There are no institutional incentives. I think the link between having standards and having the standards respected in the field is to have the appropriate institutional incentives. Most of the incentives in the police bodies in Mexico are related to disciplinary issues, like whether they have the complete uniform, whether they're punctual or not. But human rights are not rewarded. The respect for human rights is not rewarded or is not within the incentive list in most police institutions in Mexico, including the federal police. So they have developed a number of standards, but they haven't developed the appropriate incentives institutionally to promote or to punish those officers responsible for human rights abuses. And finally, the technological developments, all this huge investment in technology has not developed to an intelligent use of the technology. We have now much more equipment that has been used for different purposes, not necessarily for gathering intelligence to combat effectively crime. Some of it has been used for espionage and some other activities, but not necessarily for policing purposes. We had a systematic operational procedure system set up at the federal police, which is very advanced and which is very good in paper. However, at least 3 notorious cases show that these systematic operational procedures did not work in the field. First of all, the low-rank officer insubordination that took place in August 2010 in Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. These officers, they actually they made public the problems they had with their mid and high ranks in terms of corruption. Then we also had the crossfire between corrupt police officers in Mexico City's International Airport. That was only in June 2012. And most recently, in August 2012, we had an ambush of the US diplomatic vehicle in Cuernavaca by federal police officers. So even if we have these very highly developed and sophisticated operational standards, they're not active in the field. And I assume it's because they don't have the right incentives. Regarding the way forward and what's going on in the current administration, they are trying, or at least rhetorically, they are saying that they are going to start rights-based policing. This means, of course, getting a framework in terms of training, in terms of operation that is respectful for human rights, but it also means mainstreaming human rights respect in police operation, which is the big challenge. They need to transform the accountability and vetting procedures. Vetting procedures are currently much more focused on trying to spot the rotten apple, let's say the corrupt police officers, but not on trying to find the chain of command problem that is behind that. And corruption is linked very much to chain of command, not only to a single corrupt officer. A corrupt officer responds to a corrupt commander, and so on. So it goes up the ladder. So if they don't, if our current vetting process is not attending this chain of command problem, we are not having an efficient vetting process. And it's something that is on the agenda, but they haven't been clear on how they will transform the vetting process to make it more efficient. We also have the issue of federal funding for local policing. Most of the funds for municipal and state police departments in Mexico comes from the federation. So it depends very much on the federation setting the priorities for these local police bodies. So it will depend very much on how they evolve in the way these standards are developed. Internal and external controls, of course, there needs to be better internal auditing, better internal controls. in 2008, they set up for the first time ever an internal auditor for the federal police bodies, but still we are lacking civilian oversight of law enforcement in Mexico, and we don't have a serious external control of law enforcement, so that needs to be balanced with internal controls. There needs to be a greater focus on crime prevention. Structurally, they are creating an undersecretariat on crime prevention, which is assumed to be the leading area in terms of policing in the new administration. However, they are appointing a number of hardliners to lead the federal police. It is General Dr. Mondragon in front of the police department of the federal police. He's also advised by General Naranjo from Colombia. And we are getting as well Enrique Galindo, who was formerly at the National Secretariat of Public Security in front of the federal police itself. And we have some good news there. We're having Lázaro Gaitán, who has been a very good police reformer in terms of in working in police the standard setting in the federal police. So we have this mixture of hardliners and proactive human rights reformers in the same department. So there will obviously be a tension between them. There needs to be a new reform model, and in terms of this, we are only getting some news on gendarmerie being set up. A gendarmerie implies getting some elements of the army forming a sort of military police to tackle organized crime, and that will depend very much on how large it is and the mandate it will have. We still have to see how it evolves. It may be a way to regulate the participation of armed forces in public security, but it may also be very dangerous to in terms of how it's legislated at the end. And we need also to enhance the professional standards. We don't know what will be the standing of the national public security system. As I told at the beginning, it was the first time that we had this institutional setting that could engage local and state and federal decision-making persons in a single council. It's not clear whether they will make it subordinate to one of the undersecretariats, or it will it will be kept in the same position. So there is a big question there in terms of what will happen to the national public security system. There is a new regional approach to fighting crime. So the Secretary of the Interior of Gobernación is now having regional meetings with different state governors and law enforcement institutions in different parts of the country. So this means much more a top-down approach in which the federal government is trying to dictate in many ways the policy securities that are to be carried out regionally. So decentralization of decision-making may be riskful because not necessarily the federal authorities have a better knowledge and more intelligence, and they know the field as well as the local operators. So I will close it here, sadly with more questions than answers, but I'll be happy to continue discussing.
Thank you, Juan, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions at the end. I'm going to pass the next presentation, introduce our speaker, Ernesto López Portillo Vargas. He is the founder and CEO of the Instituto para la Seguridad y Democracia, which was established 10 years ago, 10 years ago this year, as the first independent Mexican organization designated just to look at police reform. He has been an advisor to the Human Rights Commission in Mexico City. He is on the board right now of México Unido contra la Delincuencia, and obviously he has opinion pieces for La Universal newspaper in Mexico, and is the author of several books and articles, including the book Seguridad Pública in Mexico, which has kind of head-started a lot of the conversations about public security in Mexico over almost 20 years ago. So Ernesto, again, as I said, is going to be presenting in Spanish. So if anyone does need interpretation, the equipment is out in the hallway. Thank you, Ernesto.
Gracias, buenos días a todas y a todos. Pues es un gusto estar aquí, es un privilegio. Gracias, Maureen, por todo tu apoyo y tu invitación. Yo creo que desafortunadamente no tenemos buenas noticias y me parece que no
And it
estamos
seems to me
construyendo un
that we are not building
preciso
a
del tamaño del problema
precise
que tenemos.
evaluation of the size of the problem that we have in Mexico in the security area.
La sociedad,
I'm referring to society, to governments,
comunicación,
to media.
se han normalizado conductas extremas,
Extreme conducts have been normalized.
violencia.
Conflict and violence has been normalized. Last Friday,
Se enfrentaron en las calles de
there
la
was
ciudad
a
de Cuernavaca
confrontation in the streets of Cuernavaca between
policías estatales
state
uniformados
police, uniformed state
con
police,
escoltas
with
del procurador
escorts
del
from
Estado.
the Attorney General's
La
office.
versión que tuvimos
The
primero
version that we had
que la policía
first was
intentaba
that the
matar al
police was
procurador.
trying to kill the Attorney General.
murieron escoltas, de hecho.
The
La versión que
bodyguards
tengo hoy
were killed.
en el periódico enfrente
The
de
version
mí,
that
el
I'm
periódico
reading in
Reforma,
today's paper, the
es que
Reforma
la
paper,
secretaria
is that
de
the
Seguridad Pública,
Secretariat
de los
for Public
policías
Security, that
uniformados,
is the head of uniformed police,
dice
is
que
saying
quienes empezaron a disparar
that those
fueron
who
los
began
escoltas,
to shoot were the bodyguards,
mientras que el gobernador
while
que
the
no.
governor is saying it wasn't that way at
fue
all,
un atentado.
that it was actually an effort
Este es un
to
ejemplo del viernes
kill
pasado y
this
la nota que
person.
les
This
muestro
is an
es
example
de
from
los
last
momentos de hoy.
Friday, and
Eso
the
no es
paper that I'm quoting from is from
puedo
today.
entender
This is
como
not
normal
normal. I cannot
no puedo
accept
aceptar
as normal
que las
a
autoridades
situation
trabajen
in which authorities
por su descrédito
are working
frente a los ciudadanos
to discredit
punto
themselves
de
before
enfrentarse
citizens to the point
con armas de fuego.
of confronting each other
Yo
with
no lo acepto como normal,
firearms. I do
pero
not
se está
accept that.
normalizando
But
en
this
México
kind of thing
las
is becoming
conductas
more normal in
extremas
Mexico,
de
these
conflicto
kinds
y
of
violencia.
extreme conducts of conflict and violence.
La seguridad es un derecho humano
Security is a human
y
right,
es un derecho instrumental.
and it is
para
an
la satisfacción de
instrumental
otros
right
derechos.
for the satisfaction of other rights.
La experiencia política en México
Political
no incluye
experience in
aún
Mexico does
la
still not
consolidación de un
include the
régimen de acceso
consolidation of a
mayoritario a
regime
los
where
derechos,
most people have
entre ellos el de
access
seguridad.
to rights, including security.
Como sucede en buena parte del
As
mundo,
happens in a
a
large
un
part of the
régimen
world,
político autoritario le corresponde un modelo
an
de seguridad
authoritarian
autoritario.
political regime has
México no
authoritarian
es aún
security
una
models.
democracia de derechos
Mexico is
consolidada.
still not a democracy
En
with
tal sentido, el
consolidated
paradigma
rights, and in that
dominante de la
sense,
seguridad
the
sigue siendo
dominant
autoritario.
paradigm of security continues to be
Desde el
authoritarian as
presidente
well.
Cedillo a la
Since
fecha,
the time of President
operado un
Cedillo
proceso
until now,
expansivo de
there has
reformas
been an
legales,
expansive
cambios
process of legal
institucionales y
reforms,
gasto en
institutional
seguridad
changes,
pública.
and a great deal of expenditures in
Juan
public
dio
security.
ejemplos
Juan gave some
varios de este
examples
proceso.
of this process.
En ese mismo
But in
periodo,
the same
el delito,
period,
la violencia,
crime,
la
violence,
inseguridad
and
también se han
insecurity
multiplicado.
have also increased significantly.
Ha dominado un enfoque
An
incremental.
incremental approach has dominated, and the formula has been to spend more, but not necessarily to spend better.
Se ha gastado más independientemente de
More
que
money
haya o
has
no
been
mejores
spent
resultados.
whether or not better results
Las
are
reformas
obtained.
legales, los
Legal
cambios
reforms,
institucionales y el
institutional
crecimiento del
changes,
gasto
and the
público
increase in public
encerrados en un
expenditures
paradigma autoritario
within an authoritarian
avanzado sin
paradigm
beneficiar a la gran
has
mayoría
advanced
del
without
pueblo.
benefiting the great majority of
Por
the
eso,
public.
la confianza social hacia
For
las
that
instituciones
reason,
no ha mejorado.
society has less and less
Siete de
trust in
cada
public
10 mexicanos
institutions.
confían poco o
7
nada
out of
en
10
la policía
Mexicans
y el sistema de
have
justicia.
little or no trust in the police and the criminal justice system. The
Exactamente
underreporting reaches about 90%, underreporting of crimes.
¿Qué quiere decir paradigma autoritario?
So what is an authoritarian paradigm of security exactly? It's a public policy model that reproduces itself without going through the citizenry. It's a model that it evaluates itself and validates itself independently of any evaluation from the public. Public security and criminal justice right now in general are functioning under that scheme. The police are especially clear example of that. Society and police have a fractured relationship based on mutual distrust. I always tell people in my conferences that they should raise their hand if they trust the police. And everybody raises their hand to say that they don't trust the police. And I say, don't worry, because the police doesn't trust you either. In our interviews, we find that that is true. Police look at the people as part of the problem, and the people see the police as part of the problem. We know that a democratic police force should have simple and swift and transparent processes to receive citizen grievances. Today, there are places where there are even external channels outside of the police itself where grievances can be accepted. But in Mexico, we do not have either internal or external channels that are functioning. We also know that the regulation and control of the use of police force is at the center of the principles of a democratic police role. However, in Mexico, this kind of regulation is still exceptional. In reality, the design and practices of policies in Mexico do not meet the requirements included in the Handbook of Police Accountability, Oversight, and Integrity of the United Nations Office. One possible way of explaining that is to look at the concept of poor political governance of security, theory of Argentine expert Marcelo Sain. That's where political authority leaves security management in the hands of civil armed institutions. So what we have here is a fundamental theme that I'm going to put before you. In Mexico, elected authorities and those who are responsible for the police and armed forces are not producing a democratic balance in such a way that the relationship between political control and operational autonomy actually benefits the citizen. In contrast, their relationship reproduces weak political control and disproportionate operative autonomy. So police practices and military practices in general are not going through filters of democratic control, whether that has to do with professional control of the use of force or citizen control through simple mechanisms for grievances. A deeper look at police role shows scenarios that many times combine efforts to improve citizen attention with very powerful operative inertias that prefer to increase deployment of troops and police rather than having true institutional reform. And this is a very extensive phenomenon all over the world. There's a preference for increasing deployment rather than going for institutional reform. The key to understanding deeply the issue of security in Mexico has to do with analyzing the balance of powers. The balance of powers between civil authority and operational authority in favor of the second. So police practices can reproduce opacity and can reject democratic controls, reducing the possibility that the police might be able to comply with constitutional principles, which are legality, objectivity, efficiency, professionalism, honesty, and respect for human rights. And that's why we can demonstrate that police have gone backwards in terms of extreme practices like torture. The weakness in political control is the base of the weakness of democratic control in the of the police, and the evidence for this is great. Another example is that the confidence trust testing model, that was the vetting process that process was the primary tool for combating police corruption in the Calderón term. But the Attorney General's office has just said that that process doesn't work, and the Ministry of the Interior has announced that they're going to revise it for modification. They're going to take it apart now that there is political opportunity, but they're not going to replace it with democratic balances that have to do with evaluating the public benefit for security or not of these kinds of evaluations that happened all over the country. My thesis is the following. The political regime in Mexico has not produced the balances necessary for democratic control of the police, and that's why the norms and practices have extreme contradictions. Just a few days ago, I received some new testimonies that confirm that there's very weak operational supervision in the federal police, which is supposedly an exemplary institution, according to the former president. Among various information that I received in these testimonies, I have heard about 70% underuse of the technology and resources that were created in the last 6-year period of Calderón. Democratic reform of the police in Mexico will never happen if the police all have operational autonomy but do not have effective internal and external controls. And that will depend on the political decision of those who are responsible for political control of the police. It's possible to keep moving forward with growing investment with Mexican and foreign resources without modifying police practices in the favor of citizens. That's what's happened so far. So the question is, how many more resources should go to the police apparatus? A better question is how better to balance investment with models of evaluation that are based on accepted standards of democratic control, like those that are included in the UN manual. I want to end with one more example. In the Senate, there's a bill that's awaiting passage, and it's an initiative, a reform initiative for creating a special auditor of the federal police. This particular bill has been designed by the institution that I work with, and it's inspired by the idea of having external control mechanisms for the police. This auditor has to do with another accountability and monitoring law that already exists in Mexico. We would propose that this special auditor would be in charge of doing external evaluations of the police in the way that independent auditors and monitors do. And there are examples in various parts of the world of this. Many of them exist in the United States. This bill was blocked when it came up for vote. It was blocked by the PAN in the Senate. This was at the end of the last Congress, and now, once again, we are searching for political support for the passage of this bill. This is one of the efforts that we've made, among many others, to try to introduce some balance within this unbalanced relationship that I have spoken of in the working hypothesis that I have just set before you. So there are a great number of protocol and laws and designs of these kinds of structures in the country, but we have not been able to have a coherent relationship between the practices and these regulations. And I think the fundamental thing is that we have not found a way to break up the police monopoly on their own operations and their own information. Thank you very much.
Very somber but accurate, I think, assessment of the situation in Mexico. And last but certainly not least, we had invited John Bailey, professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University, to comment on this. He also directs the Mexico project at the Center for Latin American Studies. He has been a great resource for me, for Wool, and I'm sure lots of others on police reform and policing in Mexico. He has a current book project, The Politics of Crime in Mexico, Democratic Governance in a Security Trap, which is looking at lots of implications of nonviolent crime as well as looking at other types of high organized crime. And so I want to thank you, John, for being here and open up to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Delight to participate with Ernesto and with Juan in historic occasion. So I'm extra pleased to be here for Duncan's debut, and thanks, Maureen, for the invitation. I have 4 or so points, and in those 4 points I have 2 questions I'll put to our panelists. Police reform is absolutely essential, and one of our colleagues wrote a book called The State in the Street, and the gist of the book is what the people see is the police. And the perception of the state is molded in good part by the behavior of the police. And so the police are not just a bureaucracy, they're a central expression of the state, and the way in which the police operate and behave is central to the way in which people view the government, the state. The one way of thinking about the police problem is to think of the crime problem, and I think of it in Mexico and other countries as a kind of a layer cake. It's the best metaphor I can come up with, which is at the top layer there are organized crime groups, which are transnational smuggling groups. These are kind of alpha groups, and they are not really by their nature violent. They are really they do evasion and corruption. But the next layer down are territory-bound criminal groups, and they're the ones that actually occupy territory, and these criminal groups can put 50, 70 armed men on the street and can confront the police at different levels, and sometimes they can even confront the army. And so the policing problem is both the alpha groups, which are the transnational groups, and then the sort of beta and gamma groups, which are the ones that occupy territory and can actually confront. And so in that case, the gendarmeria is really very important because it's the kind of a police which is a heavy confrontational police. And it looks like the Carabineros in Chile or the Policía Nacional in Colombia. And so I'm very interested to see the way in which this gendarmeria evolves, whether it's a police force which is not really very good and is really militarized and not very effective, or whether it can become a Carabinero type police force, which is actually pretty effective. And then the third layer is what we call common crime, although nobody's really sorted out common and organized crime very well, but it acts usually by small groups or one or more persons, and this is the sort of street and neighborhood type crime, and these interact in really complicated ways that we can't really get into here, but are very important. And then this whole cake rests on a platter, which is civic culture, and I liked Ernesto's story when how many of you trust the police, and then that's okay because the police don't trust you either. And that takes us into civic culture. And the Mexican case is one of a high non-compliance with the law. If you do surveys and compare Mexico with other countries, it ranks near the bottom in the region. If you ask the question, how many of your fellow countrymen do you think actually obey the law? The Mexican case is really very bad. And so it's very, very important to take into account this whole context and the challenge to policing which comes in this form. So I get to my second point, and here's where I'll raise a question. Juan and Ernesto and I think Duncan and Maureen are really interested in public policy and institutions. And what we really need at the table here is an anthropologist, because what's really important is the informal codes and the culture of the police. And we don't know really how to deal with that very well. And our colleagues are aware of it, and they've done good work on it. But what's really critical, I'll never forget, in Nuevo Leon, I was there at a police training, and this young cadet, we were trying to teach culture of lawfulness there. And this young cadet says, I get it, but does my comandante get it? When I go out into the force and I enter into that culture, where's that culture going to take me? And so we need, and I'll put this as a question to my panelists, what can we do with respect to the culture of the police, which is so important with respect to its behavior? Third point is, and our colleagues have covered this very, very well, which is the unbalanced nature of the reforms to date. And it's unbalanced in a couple senses. So much more resources and efforts gone into the police and into the intelligence side, and not very much, or less anyway, has gone into judicial reform and into this institution, which is terribly important, but which is really very lagging, which is the Procuraduría. And the chain of justice is that the police are sort of the sharp end of the spear, and then it goes into to the attorneys and into the judicial process, and that's really a difficult area, and it needs a lot more attention. And everything that I've heard from the incoming government says that it will get attention. I'd be curious to hear from our colleagues whether that's really going to happen. And then unbalanced as well, because most of the efforts gone to the federal level, and less product anyway, apparent product, is taking place at the state and local level. Which takes me to my last point, which is so much of the dynamic of policing and of change in Mexico is driven by, this will come as a shock here in D.C., I'm sure, it's driven by politics. I know, it's amazing. It is driven by parties and elections. And what's really interesting is the Mexican party system is terribly insulated from its public. The parties have almost a monopoly over access to the ballot, and they have enormous resources, and they have top-down controls over so much that happens in the country. And yet, as our colleagues have pointed out, what really has to happen to make these changes go forward are initiatives at the state level and at the local level. And so I was interested to hear the colleagues mentioning the cases of Morelos and Nuevo León. And the question that I would put to the colleagues is, I haven't seen much by way of leadership on the part of the governors. And much of the conversation during the administration of Calderon was his frustration with the lack of cooperation that he was getting from the governors and from the local level. And so my question that I put to the colleagues is there change going on such that the governors are becoming more aware of the issue of public security, and is that issue translating into kind of voter pressure? And do you see any evidence that the governors are beginning to, in effect, realize that and are beginning to operate? And even more difficult is at the local level, whether the mayors are actually beginning to perceive or deal with the importance of this issue, and whether there's pressure that's building up from the electorate and whether they're responding to it. So thanks very much. It was I learned quite a lot. It's very, very useful.
Thank you. Thank you, John, for your comments and obviously for your questions. And I think we can start there and then open it up to everybody else in terms of question and answer. And I will take advantage of my position here as moderator and add one more question to that list, which John actually already mentioned, is what happens with the Policía Ministerial, the famous judiciales, in terms of their role. I think, especially from a human rights perspective, of the police that are more likely to use torture to obtain confessions, or who have the kind of lack of investigative capacity to really put together a case that can stand up in court. So how much are you seeing an emphasis or kind of a focus on how do you strengthen that police force, which is definitely kind of separate from the preventative measures of the state or federal police agencies? So I don't know who would like to start here with Juan?
Okay. Well, these are very challenging questions. Thank you very much to both of you. First of all, regarding police culture, I think it's definitely the challenge, and part of the gap between having the standards and having them implemented has to do with police culture. I think most of the larger police bodies in Mexico, they have some syndicates working inside and actually taking larger decisions and more fundamental decisions than the police chiefs, and that's something that's absolutely modeling how far can we go reforming the police institutions. So that's what I meant in terms of having vetting procedures that analyze the chain of command structure. Whenever there is such a high, like an intricate corruption system as it is in Mexico nowadays, and as it has been for many years, the linkages between high officers and low rank officers has to be analyzed. And in addition, I think there are a number of studies now that they are trying to link electoral behavior and public security offers by politicians at state level. They're trying, at least quantitatively, to find out how local agendas, local political electoral agendas are being affected by public security. There are not so many results so far. We're starting to study these issues in Mexico, but it will be interesting to see how these studies develop and how we get more literature analyzing this phenomenon. Of course, most of it has to do with political affiliation in Mexico, and I think in the past years there was a wider decision-making range allocated to governors, but at the same time, most of the resources were allocated for the federation. So they could have greater decision-making power, but not necessarily the resources to implement it. So they were still tied to federal funds to make their decisions happen. So they would have to change that formula. That has to do with fiscal reform and with getting other ways to guarantee that states will have more independence in setting their own public security agendas and strategies. And finally, in terms of the investigative police and the PGR, I think it is If they set up the gendarmerie as they're trying to do, they would create a reactive force there, and they would. We reinvent federal police every 6 years in Mexico. 2 administrations ago, we had the Federal Agency for Investigations, which was supposed to be the elite police, and they invested a lot of resources in it. Then, in the last administration, we had the federal police, a huge amount of resources was invested, and we saw what happened. And now they're trying to set up a gendarmerie, which is the fashionable thing to talk about now in the federal government, and it's supposed to be the answer. But if they do create a reactive force that deals with actually anti-narcotics and combating organized crime, and they allocate resources at PGR, the federal attorney, to actually create a proper investigative police that has not only the standards but the institutional incentives to respect civil rights, then we would be able to see a change. I see that the current general attorney is very much aware of this problem. However, there are a number of governance problems within the institution, and of course there is corruption that has to be tackled. So we still have to see how that goes.
Me gusta siempre encontrarme con John, porque siempre va un poco más allá. Pide más. Sí, yo estoy de acuerdo en que la antropología nos da mejores respuestas para muchas preguntas. Afortunadamente en el instituto tenemos antropólogos a cargo de proyectos que reúnen otras disciplinas, pero ciertamente son los antropólogos los que conducen el método, y eso me parece que es la clave de la observación antropológica. Nosotros estamos haciendo siempre la pregunta, ¿qué es la policía en México? Y es una pregunta infinita, es inabarcable, pues, en términos de interpretación y análisis. La policía es un espacio de sobrevivencia, es un escenario profundamente hostil, es un escenario que yo he llamado muchas veces residual. La policía es un espacio donde el gobierno pone lo que no quiere en ningún lado y donde la sociedad pone lo que no quiere en ningún lado. El instituto a mi cargo intenta entender a la policía. Y entonces tratamos de crear un mecanismo de conversación que nos acerque, primero para tener algo de confianza, y segundo para tratar de construir alternativas de mejora que estén fundadas en la experiencia de la policía y en el saber de la policía. Nosotros no imponemos una reforma o una idea de una reforma a la policía porque no sirve absolutamente para nada. Lo hemos aprendido con el tiempo. A un policía promedio, si uno le da el estándar de uso de la fuerza, no le sirve. Cuando menos en mi experiencia en México, un policía promedio se siente muy amenazado por un protocolo de uso de la fuerza. Le da miedo, porque no ha aprendido a defender la vida así. No le han dicho que tiene que seguir reglas, no le han puesto las reglas. Peor que eso, cuando le ponen las reglas, no le dan los recursos para cumplirlas. Entonces se genera un escenario de profundo conflicto con las normas. El policía tiene una perspectiva opresiva, conflictiva, incluso violenta de las normas. Pensemos, por ejemplo, un momento en que somos policías. Imaginemos que tenemos el uniforme, el arma, y estamos en la calle. Resulta que tenemos que actuar ante un hecho, pero no sabemos si vamos a tener defensa jurídica. No sabemos si va a haber defensa jurídica. La experiencia que tenemos es que no. Y que la institución va a abandonar al policía cuando actúe. lo va a entregar al fiscal. Entonces, es una experiencia de supervivencia. Como lo dijo Maru Suárez, antropóloga, por cierto, John. Sobrevivencia, ella le llama una experiencia de abandono institucional y aislamiento social. Entonces, la discusión es muy amplia, no hay tiempo ahora para hacerla toda ella y quizá nunca la logremos hacer toda ella, pero empieza por la Constitución. En la Constitución política de los Estados Unidos mexicanos, el régimen de derechos de la policía está fracturado. Los policías son ciudadanos de segunda, desde la Constitución. No tienen, por ejemplo, derecho a ser reinstalados, aun si, habiendo sido separados del cargo, ellos, por algún recurso legal, mostraran que tienen la razón, no los van a reinstalar, por mandato constitucional. Hemos constitucionalizado la reducción de los derechos de la policía, y es a la policía a la que le pedimos que defienda los derechos de todos. No funciona, no funciona. Le imponemos a la policía un mandato, y la policía vive en conflicto con la sociedad, porque su certeza es que la sociedad nunca le ha dado a la policía lo que le debe. Esta es una certeza, a mi entender, histórica. Es una impronta histórica de la policía. Ni los políticos ni la sociedad no se entienden y no se apoyan. Sobre todo el conflicto es con los políticos. El tema del liderazgo del que hablas, John, es un tema muy complejo, porque creo que ante los costos de la crisis de violencia e inseguridad, tenemos que repensar la relación entre premio, control y sanción en materia de seguridad, para los políticos y para los operadores. Porque lo que está pasando con algunos gobernadores es que están empezando a reentender el problema, no por una vocación democrática en el ADN, sino por los costos que el problema ha traído. Y eso algunos lo discutimos hace tiempo como una posibilidad. La violencia y la inseguridad me cuesta tanto que tengo que pensar en alternativas. Y esas alternativas incluyen probablemente empezar a pensar, por ejemplo, en el ciudadano. Y entonces de pronto vienen ideas del observatorio, cosas así, de cómo estructurar un monitoreo ciudadano. Pero son ideas normalmente erráticas, tropezadas, poco estructuradas, porque tampoco hay un conocimiento de los controles democráticos de la policía. Este texto que yo citaba de Naciones Unidas no circula en general entre los operadores que yo conozco, no saben ni que existe. Por poner un ejemplo, ustedes tienen bibliotecas enteras de Police Accountability. Nosotros, unos cuantitos materiales, y casi nadie los ha leído. Entonces, el tema es muy complejo porque requiere una aproximación multidimensional. La cultura de la policía está hecha por una impronta histórica conflictiva y violenta, y requiere ser transformada, en nuestra perspectiva, con una propuesta también hacia la propia sociedad. La sociedad tiene que aproximarse de otra manera a la policía. Una buena noticia para nosotros es que los ejercicios de conversación para construir agenda de problemas y agenda de soluciones entre la comunidad y la policía funcionan. Ahí nos está yendo muy bien. Incluso en colonias altamente conflictivas nos está yendo muy bien cuando logramos que líderes vecinales y la policía hablen. Estamos hablando de comunidades que tienen en ocasiones años. Ellos mismos no recuerdan cuándo fue la última vez que hablaron con la policía. O sea, uno le pregunta a la policía cuándo habla con la gente, y la policía dice, no hablo con la gente. Y la gente te dice, no hablo con la policía. Entonces, ¿qué está haciendo la policía? Otra cosa, administrando sus propios problemas. En comunidades donde la gente está sola, administrando sus problemas. Gracias.
Gracias. We have a little bit over 20 minutes for question and answer, so I'm going to open it up to everybody here, and I think we're going to do 3 questions at a time, so if you could raise your hand. I think the microphone is going around in the back.
Buenos días. Muchísimas gracias por sus comentarios súper útiles, muy valiosos y realmente me han dejado bastante preocupada por la
Left me
situación
with
en
a lot of
México.
concern about the situation in Mexico. That's good. Yes, more concerned than I was before. This morning on the radio, they announced that they're going to announce the security prevention strategy in Mexico. I don't know if perhaps you could talk about the prevention strategy a little bit. But my specific question is, in terms of all of the defective processes like the vetting process, for example, what's happening here? We still haven't been able to leave behind the authoritarian structure. Is that the issue? Is it a lack of political will? Is it a lack of capacity? Is it that we don't really know how to do it in Mexico? What's happening? Why haven't we had progress after so many years?
Two more questions.
Hola, buenos días.
Good morning. I'm from Mexico, and I'd like to ask Mr. Portillo about the statistic that he mentioned that 7 out of every 10 people do not trust the police. I'd like to ask if those 70% interviewed know how to distinguish between federal and local police. Because in Mexico, we have a lot of people believe that all policemen are the same, but we know that federal policemen have other obligations, and local policemen, well, they're a joke. I'm from Mexico, and they're a joke. And so I think maybe the trust statistic has a little bit to do with the fact that people in Mexico don't really distinguish between the various police groups. Yes, just a couple of reflections more than questions. In the scenario that Ernesto mentions, it seems like there's a component that's missing, and that's the relationship of a mutual distrust between police and society. That's true, but there's also the component of political leadership, and so there's mistrust among all of these actors. There's mistrust between police and citizen, between police and political leadership, and it goes around. And so there's all of these components together aggravate the problem. And if you add to this the issue of the justice system, sort of a silent witness, and then you have different sectors in civil society. There's the private sector, which is also not trusted by the police or society very much. And that, so that fracture is much more multifaceted than just a break between police and society. I do agree that the police know that they're going to be abandoned by the government structure, and that they do everything possible for their own police career to try to defend themselves. The other thing is that we're talking about police reform without defining why we are reforming the institutions, what for, because security policy is not police policy. We have police in Mexico as a model that's copied in Central America. They're copying a preventative police model, but they really don't do anything preventative. It's just in name. And so when you look at the budgets of the various police forces, it's curious. More than 80% of the programs that are justified as prevention in the area of security are outside of the Ministry of the Interior. No idea what's happening in these programs. And so they define themselves. The other thing is, if you analyze the budget of the police and you look at just the salary total, and what's left behind, there's only about 7% or 0.7% of the budget that's going to prevention. So what kind of preventative police can we talk about? And so when we talk about police reform without saying what we want a police reform for, you know that my prevention is to, my proposal is to decentralize prevention. And I think that the federal police should deal with complex crimes and local police should deal with actual preventative policing. The third thing that I wanted to mention, and I won't say anything else after that, is about the issue of the in our region, I want to be a little provocative here, we only have 2.5 police groups that have adopted the Leto Policial, Nicaragua, who developed a new police after the revolution, and the Carabineros in Chile. And they did this to distance themselves from the military that was involved in the military coup. So they have
que originalmente tenía un trasfondo político, lo ha convertido en algo absolutamente técnico y les va bien.
Turned something into something that's absolutely technical and it's going pretty well.
No toda la fuerza necesaria como usa el militar. El militar tiene por objeto al enemigo. El policía tiene por
military and the police have two different objectives entirely. The police is supposed to protect the citizens and the military is supposed to fight against armed enemies. But if we don't have an overall security policy, it's really hard to define a police policy and very hard to say what we want a police policy reform for. And finally, on the gendarmerie, I come from Argentina and we do have a gendarmerie there. The model that that John proposes, takes as a model the case of the Carabineros in Chile and the Colombian police, but I don't think it's applicable to Mexico. In Argentina, the model works, but it has a great number of problems, so I think there's a lot of care that needs to be taken to not generate problems here.
English? Whatever. English would be easier to let our interpreter rest a little bit.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So in terms of the national prevention strategy, for the first time, Secretaría de Gobernación, the Ministry of the Interior, is trying to get a prevention strategy going on. So what they're doing is based on two models, the social acupuncture, which means trying to spot trying to find red spots in different societal environments to make specific interventions on risk factors. And the other model is citizen security that involves actually framing security policies based on the respect of human rights and on citizen participation, etc. So these are the two, let's say, methodological or basis of the program. Departing from this, what the ministry, at least rhetorically, is trying to say is that they will be engaged in policing and non-policing actions to set, for the first time ever, a security policy in Mexico. So on the one hand, the Ministry of Interior is now administering the federal police, which has been, the former public security secretary has been dismantled in Mexico, and it has been merged into the Secretaría de Gobernación, the Ministry of Interior. So for the first time, what they're trying to do is to get the prevention elements that were in the federal police, that they were always inoperative. Absolutely agree with that. Most of the resources, they were used for reaction and for anti-narcotics. So it was absolutely useless to have a preventive unit within the federal police because they didn't work, simply. And so what they're trying to do now is to merge the National Center for Crime Prevention and the preventive elements of the federal police into an undersecretariat and to create a national prevention strategy that will be linked to the National Development Plan and in that sense transformed into federal public policy guidelines for the next 5 years. So that will be that'll be the big announcement that they'll be doing today in Aguascalientes.
Sí. Bueno, primero voy a contestar un poco provocativamente, digamos, en el tema de si la gente distingue o no a la policía. Yo diría que eso es irrelevante, en un primer sentido, que la gente debería poder confiar en cualquier policía. O sea, la policía nace, cuando menos así lo entendimos muchos, la policía nace como un proyecto fundado en la confianza social. Es decir, en teoría, en democracia, una policía que no merece la confianza social no es una policía democrática, es otra cosa. En efecto, la gente logra distinguir a la policía y hay ciertos cambios en las respuestas. Hay encuestas internacionales, encuestas nacionales, encuestas estatales y encuestas municipales. Y en todas ellas domina la desconfianza, en todas las policías. La desconfianza en este tipo de encuestas de las que hablo, que es una contradicción frente a otro tipo de ejercicios, la desconfianza crece con las policías más cercanas en cierto tipo de estudios. Pero otro tipo de estudios han dicho lo contrario también, que entre más cerca está la policía, se han tenido experiencias, es más común que se hayan tenido experiencias de resolución de algún tipo de conflicto, y entonces hay confianza. Entonces, no está claro, lo que está claro es que la mayoría confía poco o nada, desde siempre en los estudios que se han aplicado en México, hasta donde yo he podido ver. En efecto, la justicia sí es un testigo silencioso. Acabamos de estar con una red de jueces en el instituto, y la crítica más fuerte hacia los jueces es de ellos mismos, algunos reformistas, como yo lo entiendo, que piensan que el tema policial sí merece que le pongan ellos atención. Pero la mayor parte de los jueces, en mi experiencia, no lo ven así. Tuvimos un ejercicio, ya van 2 ejercicios fallidos con la Suprema Corte de Justicia en México, tratando de crear procesos de sensibilización y de capacitación hacia jueces. No se ha podido lograr, cuando menos nosotros no lo hemos podido lograr. Yo quiero terminar insistiendo en el tema de los equilibrios con respecto a los controles de la policía. Y aquí dejo un tema que me parece fascinante en términos de investigación, pero muy complejo, que es, la hipótesis es esta. Tanto la policía como la clase política, como la sociedad, en nuestra región, siguen entendiendo que el secreto policial la fortalece. Que el secreto policial es una condición intrínseca de la función. Es decir, no logramos articular procesos políticos, sociales, institucionales, que se pregunten a profundidad sobre los límites de la opacidad policial. Entonces, esto es un tema crítico porque no estamos desarrollando los equilibrios adecuados en lo que respecta a lo que la policía puede y lo que la policía no puede y no debe abrir a la sociedad. Entonces no nos movemos en los márgenes de discusión y en consecuencia no estamos creando nueva tecnología que permita la visibilidad
allows more democratic visibility and more control over the police. So my concern, and I continue to say, if we continue to invest and we continue to have resources flow both nationally and internationally, we're going to strengthen the institutional design, but the key issues will not be transformed and the incentives will not be changed because we're not having a more thorough overhaul. We do not have any champions in the legislature on this issue. On the contrary, I'll give you one example and I'll end. The Jornada is published some statements about 5 days ago where 2 deputies asked for anonymity to talk about what the Secretary of Defense said in a meeting. And these are national congressmen.
Y otros
And I will give you the word, I promise.
dicen lo que el secretario de la Defensa acaba de decir. El secretario de la Defensa
Now,
seguramente
others
acaba de
are
decir
talking, and they are saying what the
que no puede seguir así.
Secretary of Defense is saying, and that is that the Army has to get out of the policing function.
Sí, yo puedo hablar, pero no puedo dar mi nombre.
But others have said, I can talk, but I can't give my name. And they're congressmen?
Pensar en los controles que se deben
So
hacer.
if this is the kind of congressman we're dealing with, how are we going to deal with congressional controls?
No.
I think we have time for one other round of questions.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Íñigo Guevara.
Hi, I'm Inigo Ibarra. Congratulations for your presentation. I wanted to ask you that within your personal experience,
¿Podrían darnos algunos
could you give
ejemplos
us
de
some examples
agencias de seguridad
of
pública
public
estatales,
security
municipales,
agencies, perhaps
que ustedes
state
podrían
agencies or
proponer como
municipal
ejemplos?
agencies that have been models that can be followed in
¿Cuáles
Mexico?
son los motivadores? ¿Cuáles son los
And what
drivers?
are the
¿Es el
driving
secretario de Seguridad Pública?
factors
¿Es la
there?
policía? ¿Es la sociedad?
Is it society? Is it the Secretary of the Interior? What's making those models work? Thank you.
Speak loud, because you're going to do it. Yeah. So here comes the microphone. But
I think changing an institution is, and particularly the culture, the values of an institution, is one of the hardest things to accomplish. And most, as you have said, most of our efforts have gone to introducing technology, to training tactics, and so forth, and not into educating, forming the leadership, the chain of command that is going to govern over these new institutions. What is being done in Mexico to address that in police academies, in the university, in the law schools, where they're by and large mostly training lawyers in the old way as opposed to into the new accusatory way, so then you have to retrain them. Is anything being done to address this culture problem?
last question over here.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation. My question is recently we've seen a lot of vigilante groups developing in local communities to do policing. My question is how does this impact any policing reform if it does, and will it have any impact, because it looks at the issues of trust and confidence and things like that. So I'd like to hear your input on those.
Thank you. So I will start with a good practice. It is always a challenge in terms of criminology to think of importing models from different systems and other countries. And it was rightly said that being Mexico a federation and having the particularities of the intricate relations between the different layers of government in Mexico, it's complex to try to get models from other countries. However, I would think very much of the Brazilian system. The national public security system in Brazil. Brazil is much more federative than Mexico in many ways. And most of the decisions, economic, political, and security decisions, are made in the states rather than the federation. Brasilia is absolutely an artificial creation, and in that sense, it's a real federation in many ways, and that is reflected into their national public security system and the way they create balances and the way they try to outweigh the power of the rich states versus that of the poorer states in Brazil, and the way they try to develop standards and to make operative frameworks for different police bodies in Brazil. I really admire what they've done there, and I think there is much to learn. And it has to do a lot with political willingness in that sense. The legislative framework between Brazil and Mexico is not the difference. And I'm writing a comparative paper between Brazil and Mexico, and it's surprisingly similar. The great difference is the political willingness and the power, the actual power of the states versus the federation to make it work. And I think that's a big difference, the big political and realpolitik difference between Mexico and Brazil, and that's how it would work. Another a big example with a very different story would be South Africa. What has happened with SAPS, with the South African Police Service, in terms of going out to the community, making consultations in line with the huge political transformation post-apartheid, has actually, of course, what we've seen of South African police now, it's very sad in terms of it's going back to repression, etc. But at least these changing moments in the 90s that they went out and they made consultations with the community, etc. It's something we also have to learn how to do in Mexico. I think the work Ernesto and others are doing in the field in this regard is very important, and we have to go on with that. As it goes with education, I come from a law school, so I'm a bit flawed in that regard. We are trying, of course, to get the next generation of lawyers in Mexico to be more sensitive about the accusatory system and particularly the role of the police. I always try to get into that. However, as I can see in the police academies, there is a huge lag between having the normative framework taught in the classes and the actual practice. And I think that's a big problem. If for instance, from the police academy, there would be a clear emphasis that the use of force protocol is protecting the police officers in the first place, because they know what to do and what they can't do, and they have a legal framework that they can be based upon. So if that would transform in terms of operational practice in the academy, it would make a big difference. Now it's most focused on shooting, on getting them to know the law, and not actually getting them to relate with citizens and what it implies in terms of patrolling, in terms of detentions, etc. So there has to be a greater emphasis in that regard. And finally, the sensitive issue about vigilante groups. Well, I've had the opportunity to work in Guerrero, which is where most of these vigilante groups have been prospering with Ernesto. We worked there for about 3 years in the mountain in Guerrero, with a very peculiar form of community policing in the mountain that is based much on indigenous culture, indigenous political practice. What we are seeing now is a deviation a bit from this traditional community policing in Guerrero that has also to do with the lack of capacity of this long arm of the rule of law that is not reaching out to Guerrero and that is not providing policing services for these communities. So it's mostly a violent reaction from members, untrained members from these communities that are using masks, that are doing vigilante work, and that is actually different from the community policing structures that were set up in other rural settings in Guerrero. So I would think it's a dangerous deviation, because there was some control, and some of the control that was taking place over the community policing was community-based, interestingly, and it was developed by civil society organizations and by groups that were concerned with analyzing how the model was being implemented in the field. And these other groups, they have absolutely no control, and it's a very dangerous development, I think.
Ernesto?
El tema de cultura institucional, desafortunadamente, no hay un desarrollo todavía en términos de incorporarlo como parte formal de un proceso pedagógico, institucional y social. Me parece que no. Creo que eso es parte de nuestros grandes pasivos. Respecto a la pregunta de nuestro amigo Íñigo, los casos, esa es una muy buena pregunta, porque me permite relacionar el tema que dije antes de control político y autonomía operativa. Los 3 casos que yo he podido directamente registrar, uno de ellos con el trabajo del propio Juan, los 3 casos prometedores o de éxito tenían mandos policiales que no eran de la carrera policial. Eso es algo que a mí me ha parecido siempre parte de una posible clave de reforma. Un psicólogo y 2 ingenieros que tuvieron la capacidad de replantear a la policía, de hacerle una nueva propuesta a la policía. Una propuesta que tuvo, me parece, al menos 2 claves.
And I think those proposals had
No
2
tolerar
key issues: not to tolerate any deviation from the rules, and to offer policemen a better deal for their lives. To say, look, this will not be tolerated, but I can offer you this. And it seems to me that this is a formula that has enormous potential. Authors have written about how police tend to act differently when they have different incentives, and that negative incentives alone tend to isolate policemen. But it seems to me to be very important to connect this idea of the legal figures that allow the control of police, but that there also be a counterweight that has to do with the operational culture. These 3 leaders had not been trained in police operations, and so that's very interesting. And that allows us to take the discussion to what kind of people do we want leading police forces. I was told that one of the experts in our country is working specifically on this issue as a key issue, and that's the relationship between the police control and operational issues. And I think if we don't break up that idea that the police have to control themselves, things are not going to turn out well. And this isn't just a Mexican problem, this is a worldwide problem. Now, why are we not advancing in social consensus to control the police? We created the National Council of Evaluation. This council was passed, but when we talked about evaluating the police, people weren't as clear on the issue, and why not? I think we need to talk about this, and we hope that young people will become more involved in these issues someday.
Thank you to our speakers, to John for commentating, and obviously thank you very much, Duncan, and the Mexico Institute for hosting this event, and thank you all for coming. I think it certainly presents lots of challenges for Mexico as we move forward, and certainly a point of the agenda within the United States. And Duncan, if you'd like to take the final word. Thank you.
First of all, thank you all for coming here. This is your place, your house to come and to engage in this kind of dialogue. I'd like to thank John, Juan, Ernesto, Maureen. Thank you so much. It was a terrific panel. I feel very fortunate to have had this as my first public event here. I'd like to say a public thank you to Alison Cordell, Miguel Salazar, Ashley Garcia, Pedro Ramirez, who will work on the Mexico Institute team and made this event possible. Thanks to the translators. Thank you very much for keeping up with us, and to the audio-video team. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again here very soon. Very soon. Thanks.
Good luck, Duncan. I hope that goes well.
How's your agenda these days?
You know, trying to finish this book and get it out. Lynn Reiner's going to publish it, so
Terrific.
that's sort of my thing. But